lawful possession of an opiate. And neither law enforcement nor public monies are further required. The police officer sees the prescription. They see that there's supposed to be 25 pills in it. If they feel like counting, they see that there's 25 pills in it. That's the end. They let the patient go. The patient goes on his way. The cop decides to spend his time protecting the community in another way. Judges know the defined parameters to follow in cases where documentation is absent. They can set up a court hearing to determine compliance. A good law protects families, patients, caregivers, and communities. Doctors and patients know that written and dated documentation is required to administer and possess cannabinoid medicines. It allows families, caregivers, doctors to care for patients without fear of arrest. Right now in the state of Texas, the feeling that I had when looking at my wife the next morning, I felt wonderful, but I also knew that to get that relief, we had to break the law. We had to put our lives at risk, and I could possibly go to jail for giving my wife relief. That is unconscionable, to treat families and communities in a way where when they treat the members of their communities who are suffering, that somehow they become a criminal. The community, as with other medicines, should see no visible changes to their cities, towns, and neighborhoods. I can tell you that time and time again, I've talked with community members, I've talked with police officers, and one of the concerns is a lot of people, and I'm going to say it, they point to California. And they say, oh my gosh, we don't want to see California and Texas. And the truth of the matter is a California bill has absolutely no chance of passing through the state of Texas House and the Senate. So we need a bill that's written for Texas, by Texans, and we'll have a bill that works for Texas, and that means that we're not going to have big neon pot signs and windows down the street so that people don't have to worry about their children driving past that and what they may perceive to be the glorification of medical marijuana. Community should be able to go on about their day and not see any changes in their community. And that's essentially what we're writing the bill for, is to make sure that at the end of the day, when this passes, unless you need it, you probably don't know it's available. It ensures that our communities are only aware of medical marijuana when and if they too need it. It requires a patient to get a doctor's recommendation, and it frees law enforcement from ambiguity when encountering patients. It allows research on medical marijuana to move forward. It frees the law enforcement of ambiguity because we put a quantity in the bill. In the bill right now we have a quantity as 2 ounces traveling or 60-day supply. What that means is that if a patient is caught with over 2 ounces while on the road, the officer knows that he can seek further. If it's under 2 ounces, it's no different than the morphine. They can go on their way. If they have over 2 ounces for the 60-day supply, and they know that it's under a 60-day supply, they have an opportunity to explain to a court of their peers why they needed more than 2 ounces, and to have their doctor testify on their behalf saying that they needed more than the amount stated in the law. The reason why the amount is important is because police officers can't judge a 60-day supply when they pull somebody over on the side of the street. This is part of us listening to the officers and listening to their concerns and making sure that we all can meet in the middle somewhere so that we don't earn powerful enemies in the Senate and in the House. Police, judges, and patients know the valid original dated recommendations are always required on said patient. The patient must be able to immediately present such documentation to law enforcement officer when possessing, transporting, and administering medical cannabis. The distinct guidelines free law enforcement from the ambiguity. We talked a little bit about that before. Police already know how to immediately identify the legal possession of opiate and other controlled substances. So it's no different with cannabinoid medicines. We make this simple for the police officer. They pull you over, they see that you have the sheet, hopefully they're pulling you over for speeding or something else and not just harassing you. And you show them that you're in compliance, and they go on about their way, you go on about yours. Consequently, neither law enforcement nor public monies are further required after proper identification is presented. So through meaningful wording in the law, the judges will know what parameters to follow in cases where compliance is questionable. They may hold a court hearing to determine compliance if it is questionable. What this legislation will not do. It's good to get rid of a lot of it's good to know exactly what it does and doesn't do. This will not legalize medical marijuana. Our bill is based upon the bill that is set in Washington. And the bill in Washington was fought up to the Washington Supreme Court. I actually have the statement at the end of the presentation from the Washington Supreme Court, but they said that a patient is still in violation of the law and that they are given an exception to the law. They're able to present a reason why they should be excluded. So it technically does not legalize medical marijuana. This is important for some of the representatives that don't want to say that they legalize it. When we look at Washington for the effect that it's had, I mean, what I care about is what happens and what the effect is for my family, what the effect is for my community. If you look at Washington, just about everybody says they have a medical marijuana law that's effective. Now, I mean, there may be some differences of opinion on certain parts of it, but in the end, if you're a patient in the state of Washington, you have access to medical marijuana, and if you are suspected of abusing the law, the police can challenge you on that in court. That's essentially what the law says. It's effective in Washington. People have safe access, or much safer access than I should say that we have here. This isn't a perfect law in everybody's opinion, but it's a law that we've come about through discussion. You know, and we're talking with all the players involved, and we're making sure that we reach something that can pass in the Texas House and Senate. It will not change the penalties for criminal delivery or possession of marijuana, and it will not provide a defense for marijuana dealers. It will not violate federal law, as each state has the freedom to determine their own criminal laws. I know that there was a question on this earlier in the early presentation. I do have a quote from the ACLU talking about how it does not violate federal law, and I'll get to that at the end of the presentation. It will not allow physicians to write a prescription for marijuana, which would technically be a violation of federal law. The word prescription is defined in federal law. We cannot, in fact, a great example is Arizona. Arizona passed a law in, was it 97, 98? And it used the word prescription in it. It invalidated the whole law. There's a reason why Arizona is not a medical marijuana state yet. Now, granted, they're going to be having another election coming up now, but for the past 12 years, patients in Arizona have had to suffer because the people who wrote that law used the word prescription rather than recommendation. We're not going to repeat that same mistake. And it will not change the FDA process. What this law will do is it will provide affirmative defense to qualified patients, families, and caregivers. It will define for patients medical eligibility, parameters regarding possession limits. And actually I'm going to read through some of the eligibility because it almost always comes up as a question. We have eligibility written down as cancer, HIV, AIDS, multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, or other seizure disorders, spasticity disorders. Intractable pain, glaucoma, either acute or chronic, limited for the purpose of this chapter to mean increased intraocular pressure, unrelieved by standard treatments and medications. Crohn's disease with debilitating symptoms, unrelieved by standard medical treatments or medications. Hepatitis C with debilitating nausea, or intractable pain, unrelieved by standard treatments or medications. Anxiety disorders including anorexia, which result in nausea, vomiting, wasting, appetite loss, cramping, seizures, muscle spasms, spasticity, when these symptoms are unrelieved by standard medical treatments, post-traumatic stress disorder, and any other medical condition or diagnoses for which a physician finds a qualifying patient may benefit from the medical use of marijuana. I'm going to get a drink of water. It's good they put that right there. And we will be the second law in the United States to mention PTSD specifically. The only other state that has actually passed a law that directly mentions PTSD is New Mexico. And it is important to note that the #1 condition that people in the state of New Mexico are qualifying for medical marijuana are for PTSD. They are soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and they represent the #1 patient population in New Mexico. We have a strong veteran population here in the state of Texas, and we need to give them the protection that they deserve in coming home with the war still inside. It will define for physicians parameters for recommending medical marijuana. It's essentially the same parameters for the patient as far as what they can recommend medical marijuana for. It will define for law enforcement parameters to identify qualified patients and their compliance. It will define for judges parameters to allow an affirmative defense and ensure that patients are allowed to present medical evidence in court. This is important right now because in the state of Texas, it is currently up to the judge. We all hear about the Amarillo case where Attorney Blackburn fought under a medical necessity case for an AIDS patient. He won the case. Now the judge had to allow that because it was medical necessity. It was a life and death decision for that person to use marijuana, and he was able to prove it. But if you're suffering from intractable pain, if you're suffering from something that's not going to kill you, that the danger to you is not perceived as immediate, then it's currently up to the judge in the state of Texas whether they even allow the jury to hear why you're using marijuana. You go into the court, and if the judge decides not to allow anyone to hear what you're saying, or your story, or why you're using it, you are treated like everybody else that goes into that courtroom and is using marijuana. There's no difference. It's up to the judge, though. Some judges will allow it, others will not. So we need to make sure that we secure this for every patient in the state of Texas, not just the people lucky enough to have an elected judge that's going to allow them to hear that, or a judge with an overfilled prison that decides that he needs to listen to patients. This will protect physicians from disciplinary action for recommending medical marijuana. We talked about that before. And it will provide for Texas an enforceable medical marijuana affirmative defense law, as patients and law enforcement must follow identification and quality compliance guidelines. And last but not least, I say it's not enough to be compassionate, we must act. And as I described, my first actions for medical marijuana were for my wife. She suffers from chronic illness with a lot of pain and nausea, and we were reluctant to try medical marijuana, and we found that it worked amazingly for us. I often tell people that the most wonderful sound that I've ever heard in my life was the sound of silence. It was the sound that I heard the day after my wife first used medical marijuana, because I didn't have to listen to her pain that morning. Since then, I've spoken with many patients around this state. I've spoken with Tim Timmons. He's a medical marijuana patient in Garland, Texas. He's got MS, and currently he has stage 4 bed sores. He's lived longer with the stage 4 bed sores than Christopher Reeve did. With all of his money and his resources, he's lived longer with those bed sores. It helps him address his spasticity, and it helps him address the pain. Patients who tell me, when I speak to them through their tears, about how they cannot use traditional pain medicine. I've talked with many veterans with PTSD who come home with the war still inside, seeking some basic relief from the war that they've carried home with them. This is about patience. It's about caring for our veterans who sacrifice so much for us. It's about a good medical marijuana law, which will be about the communities where they live. It's also about science, politics, and the law, but for those who need it, for the patients who are suffering, for the families that are watching them suffer, and for the communities that they're suffering in, from the churches that they go to the organizations that they belong to. This is about compassion. And we need to do something to make this a safe state, to be a patient seeking relief from suffering.
Yes, it was a very moving presentation by Steve Bretzen. Like he said in the entire presentation, Steve basically has had to break the law to provide marijuana to his chronically ill wife, who had an unspecified but painfully degenerative disease, a medical condition, and basically they are reluctant. They were reluctant to do this. They didn't even, it was kind of, they were desperate, and they found miraculous relief. We've had this on a number of situations. One of the few, half dozen or so compassionate use people who are legally allowed marijuana, who are literally given tins of marijuana cigarettes rolled for them by the federal government. Herb Rosenfeld from Florida is a man I met and talked to on a couple of different occasions, and Irv has, said, I was never really into marijuana. He's a stockbroker in Florida. I'm a bourbon and branch water kind of guy, and I never thought about it. But he has a very rare degenerative condition involving internal growths on his joints, and is in intractable pain constantly, and has found miraculous relief with medical marijuana, and it has basically saved him from having to deal with the various opioids and other powerful psychoactive painkillers and analgesics. And it was rather funny to see him in a crowded convention room in Washington, D.C., standing at a lectern and literally reaching into a large tin of marijuana cigarettes, and to the delight of several hundred marijuana decriminalization activists, light up a joint and start smoking it while he's talking, and being legally able to do so. There has been, in my own experience, a lot of people who, and I talk to them about this subject, the eyes roll almost more often than I like when people think that this is all a joke, and yet it isn't. There have been a number, the studies of endocannabinoids and marijuana internationally is voluminous. There was a lot of research done before 1937. A huge amount of research was done in the last 150 years. Tinctures of marijuana, tinctures of cannabis, and marijuana is actually the pejorative term, basically of Hispanic origin, but cannabis, tinctures of cannabis, which is basically cannabis in alcohol, suspended in alcohol, have been used in medicine for hundreds of years. Marijuana has been a medicine in recorded history for almost 5,000 years. Queen Victoria used it for her menstrual cramps. You go on and on and on. And for those people who are in intractable pain, and especially for those people who are wasting away or either have medical conditions involving acute nausea, or in chemotherapy for cancer patients, where it almost always involves intense nausea, the results are literally miraculous, because, well, let's think about it. So, the whole pejorative thing of marijuana and making people basically causing mild euphoria and the munchies, quote unquote. Obviously, something like that would seem to be quite just rationally, just from common sense level, to be useful to someone who is A, in pain, and B, suffering from nausea, either as part of a disease or illness, or as part of the powerful chemicals that may be used to treat their disease, specifically usually we're talking usually chemotherapy from cancer. And the anecdotal evidence is overwhelming. Todd McCormick, a medical marijuana activist for years, was, I believe, a childhood cancer victim, and you know, it was funny. He was talking about this at one convention, or at one, and he was saying, you know, it was almost accidental that they discovered this, because you know, he was going in for his treatments and he's always came out. He was a young child, 11 or 12 at the time, and would be subjected to chemotherapy, would, you know, go through the vomiting, the intense nausea. And he said, you know, my poor little single mom, who was a, you know, little hippie from the 60s, had me in the car, and there I was, just sick as a dog after going to the doctor, and her nerves were frayed, and she just basically lit up a joint and smoked it in front of me, and just to calm her nerves. And I found that from the secondhand smoke, my nausea was relieved. And at the age of 11 or 12, some people would say, "Oh, you actually doing, you know, smoking in front of your children," which some people would object to. But in this case, in this particular situation, the serendipity of discovering this led to what he considered a very sincere and effective means to deal with the pain of his chemotherapy treatments. A number of people have stumbled upon this. As we have Lester Grinspoon of Harvard Medical School accidentally discovered that it helped his own son, who was dying of cancer, and you know, there is definitely something there. Steve Bretzen also talked about in the problem with soldiers coming from the war, and like you said, we're having our troops come back sometimes after, and then going back repeatedly, sometimes going back into wartime service, usually 11 or 12-month tours, 3 and 4 times, and this is these are deeply these, especially in the 2006, 2007, these could also be very, very violent tours of duty, dealing with chronic stress. Some of these units had a couple of hundred contacts in their tours, and when even those that did not have contacts, military engagement, combat, there was constant and continuous stress. You're dealing in a hostile environment, and you're in patrols and dealing with IEDs, never knowing when there's a mine or an IED going to explode, and the debilitating stress excuse me, has been very traumatic. PBS's Frontline and others have done shows about how deeply traumatized these soldiers come back with what has traditionally been called the soldier's heart. Steve so eloquently said that when the war's still inside them. And these guys come back, many times they are treated on site and during their deployments with powerful psychoactive drugs, antidepressants, and then they come back, and all of a sudden they're out of combat, they're back home, they're with their families, or still in the Army, and these guys have issues, and they're in an environment where they're supposed to maintain a stoic facade. There is there's great deal of shame involved in admitting any kind of weakness, and it's also for those who basically made the Army a career and are trying to last out a 20-year enlistment. The idea of talking about their problems and inner demons, it can be very detrimental to their careers. So the Army has only belatedly begun dealing with this in any way. And there is some counseling, and also, once again, powerful psychotropic drugs are being administered. It's, somehow, because of the stigma of marijuana through popular media and it being illegal, you've had this situation where they can't even do research, which is really sad. It's an amazingly, it's cowardice. It's intellectual cowardice. I mean, we for a lot of people know of the situation of thalidomide, which was a sleeping pill that was marketed in Europe, and it came very quickly to the market. Drugs take a long time, even since for the last half a century. It's a very time-consuming process to get drugs certified in the United States, but the drug came very quickly onto market as a sleeping pill in Europe. And tragically, what happened was this thalidomide caused birth defects in children, and specifically their limbs would be withered. And this was about 1962, and it was just a terrible situation because you had several dozen children, 60 or so, several dozen children born with deformed limbs. And they traced it back to thalidomide, and it was immediately yanked off the market and kind of just discarded. And it was only in the late 80s, and they were going through and they're dealing in cancer research, and they're dealing with, you have various cancer growths, and these malignant growths grow very rapidly, and they're very deformed and kind of very unpleasant. They're large, blood-gorged, really ugly growths, and one of the first things they do is they, of course, grow blood vessels to feed themselves, because the one thing, it's a parasitic organism, and they were thinking, is there any way for us to medically retard the blood flow, or using various angiostat drugs, which basically retard the ability of the cancer growth to grow a circulatory system to the body to nourish itself. And they were going, they thought this was a very interesting and useful line of research, and literally by accident, after hundreds of different chemicals, they said, well, let's try thalidomide. What could, they knew it was dangerous for pregnant women. Of course, they used it only on male subjects. And lo and behold, oh my gosh, this thing retards the growth of circulatory system, of blood vessels to a cancer tumor, and is now used in medical treatment of certain kinds of cancers. Obviously, you don't give this to pregnant women, but for any man who is never going to get pregnant, it would be obvious that this person could use this, and not without any known serious side effects. So, if we can use thalidomide, why can't we at least research the use of cannabis? And as normal and other organizations in the drug reform movement, we've always said, just do the research. We're a nation of explorers. We're a nation of innovators. We're a nation of inventors and people and business people who find new and better ways of doing things. And it seems irrational and cowardly to be afraid of something just because it's featured in Cheech and Chong movies, when you could at least say, well, let's explore this and see under what circumstances can this be a useful drug to people. And the idea you know, of not allowing this to be used to help the sick and dying is just medieval. It really, truly is. We have a break and with another film clip, and we'll go to that right now.
Okay, maybe a little of the money I spend on marijuana supports terror and violence.
Right.
And that's because marijuana is illegal.
Exactly.
When I buy a beer, that doesn't support terror because beer is legal, right?
Now you've got it.
So what you're saying is if we make marijuana legal and regulate it like beer, that wouldn't support violence.
Did I say that?
Hi, I'm Ethan Nadelman, the founder and executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance. You're watching Drugs, Crimes, and Politics. Hope you enjoy it.
Yes, and that was Ethan Nadelman. He was recently featured on the O'Reilly Factor just a couple of days ago, involving medical marijuana and such. And once again, you know, the same old gobbledygook is being peddled. O'Reilly was saying, well, because of the harm to children and the family, why would we ever allow this? And of course, Ethan Nadelman said, well, you know, if your reasoning, and he says, he very politely disagreed with him. I think we have a caller here. Okay. Caller, you're on the air.
Yes, I had a quick question. How long does it take for marijuana to get out of your system?
Yes, that's a very good question. And let's take off that ringer here. I think that'll take care of it. A very good question. One of the things in dealing with employment issues, because of the extensive drug testing that goes on in pre-employee screening, is that most drugs, of course, if you're taking heroin or cocaine, they come out of the body within a few 1 to 2 days. What people who have used marijuana have found is that because it is soluble in the fat soluble, it is let's turn that off. Because it is fat soluble, it will stay in the body and is detectable within up to a month. Some say 2 months, but usually for a heavy user, at least 1 month after you stop, you can still be, it's still detectable in a urinalysis. Caller, you're on the air.
Hey, John, this is Dean Becker. How you doing?
Doing great, Dean.
Yeah, I wanted to touch base with you guys this week. You've been talking about the Texas Compassionate Care outfit, right?
Yes, we have.
I got to meet with them yesterday, and I'll tell you what, those guys are first class. They've got their eye on the ball. I think they've got a good chance to do something in this coming legislative session. Would be good if people would, join forces with them. I'm sure you've got their website up on screen once in a while, and please, it's time for folks to do their part. You know the truth, you've heard the truth, you've seen it over the years, and it's time to speak that truth and change this silliness of the laws against people smoking cannabis to treat their physical ailments. It's
Absolutely.
It's no business of the government, certainly not of the police, and it's just time to be brave enough to speak to these people in positions of power to do something about it. That's what we do on my Drug Truth Network radio programs. We're currently on 74 affiliate stations in the U.S. and Canada, and just this past week we had Mr. Otis McClay stepped in for me. I wanted to let folks know my girlfriend Pam is doing much better. She had double bypass surgery, but she's now at home resting up, and I was tending to her. That's why Otis was doing the first guest host ever in 9 years of our programs.
Right.
But this coming week, we're going to have Jody Emery. She's the wife of Mr. Mark Emery, who's currently in solitary confinement in a U.S. prison for having a phone conversation recorded. And he's in there for some 2 months approximate. She'll be talking with us about his situation. He's the gentleman who sold millions of marijuana seeds, some of them to Americans, and the U.S. government thought he was one of the most dangerous drug kingpins on the planet, so they insisted that Canada turn him over to spend 5 years behind bars here in the U.S. And Mark's a hero to many people. He used the money he made from selling those seeds and gave it to people to promote NORML and other drug reform organizations to help them get the word out and to help get ballots, voter referendum signed and so forth to get the laws changed. A couple of folks we're going to be talking to in the next couple of weeks. We're going to be talking to Mr. Ethan Nadelman, who was recently on air with Mr. Bill O'Reilly, talking about PSA they had featuring Mr. Sting, George Soros, and Montel Williams. We're going to be talking with Judge James P. Gray. He's got a great new book, A Voter's Handbook. He's also author of Why the Drug Laws Have Failed, What We Can Do About It, Judicial Indictment of the War on Drugs. I think he'll be joining us next week. We have in the wings Mr. Charles Bowden, who's written another book, Murder City, Ciudad Juarez and the Global Economy's New Killing Fields, which tells the story of the city of Juarez where in any given day there may be 50, 60, 70 people killed in this drug war violence. We have been speaking with Mr. Ed Rosenthal, who's got a brand new book, Marijuana, the Grower's Handbook, which is actually an official publication of Oaksterdam University. We're going to be talking to folks about how they can grow their own quality cannabis. We've got Mr. Dave Fielding. He's the author of Cocaine Nation, another book that is exposing the fraud, the corruption, and the involvement of the Central Intelligence Agency in the drug trade itself. And in general, what I guess I'm trying to say is, folks, the truth is on our side. We have exposed the fraud of this drug war. It's no longer necessary to be afraid and cower from speaking that truth. If you'd like to tune in to our radio shows, please tune in this coming Sunday at 6:30 and to 7:30 p.m. For our interview with Jody Emery and some of these other folks I've been speaking about here. And that's available on 90.1 FM right here in Houston. If you're in Galveston area, it's 89.5. And you can always check it out on the web at kpft.org. And hundreds of my programs featuring the words of doctors, scientists, congressmen, politicians, you name it, are available on our website, which is drugtruth.net. And the James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy has recently started storing the bulk of our archives, where hundreds, some 600 of our shows are available.
All right.
That's bakerinstitute.org/DTN. John, you guys keep up the good work and kick them in the butt. Have them contact those folks for compassionate care here in Texas.
Oh, absolutely. We're really looking forward to these guys doing some good work. And thank you for calling in, Dean. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And you're doing the Lord's work here. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, John. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye. That was Dean Becker, radio host of The Unvarnished Truth. And
hello,
Dean, you still there?
Oh, I'm here.
Yeah, sorry. Thought you'd hung up on me here. I had seen the gentleman who had done Murder City being interviewed on Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! That should be just a fascinating show, because it was stunning, because he's been down there for years, and your typical hard-boiled crime reporter, and he was a hoot to listen to, and it's just tragic down there because. He also he integrates it all. He connects the dots. He talks about the drug trade, the profit because of it is a prohibited product, the effects of NAFTA, political corruption, the traditional culture, and how everything has worked together to just make a cauldron of violence and just grotesque stupidity down there. And it's just really tragic what's happening down there. With 22,000 people died in the last 5, 6, 7 years.
Right. I had Charles Bowden on my show, I'm thinking 3 or 4 years ago for another of his books I can't think of the title of, but he, as you say, hard-nosed reporter. I talked to his press secretary the other day, and she said he's down in the Mississippi, Louisiana area. Sure, he's fixing to rip a new one over this BP oil down there as well.
Well, it's always great to hear from you, and like I said, keep up the great work. You also have a daily short, correct? A 5-minute.
Yes, it's in Houston. It's Monday through Friday. It airs at 9:57 a.m. Used to air at the proper time, but it's called the 420 Drug War News, and it's a little 3-minute segment each morning on 90.1 FM at 9:57 a.m. And we do 7 of them. Some cities around the country, around North America, run them a couple of times a day, 7 days a week. But we do have, the 7 shows on here in Houston.
Excellent. Once again, it's just one drop of water at a time against the stone, and maybe one day the stone will just dissolve away.
That's the nature of the beast, and John, through our work, we are awakening and encouraging other journalists to do something about this. It's becoming more frequent that they do talk about prohibition rather than calling it drug-related crime.
Right.
And I think that's thanks to our work and our insistence that they treat it with respect.
Yeah, and it's just truth and labeling here, because it gets right down to that. We are surrounded by drugs, and we need drugs. Everybody wants to be able to keep their aspirin. Everybody, what would this world be without drugs like antibiotics and all the various medicines that keep us alive? The word is not a dirty word. It's a neutral word. It's what you use it for and what it does to you. And the semantics in this political battle are just so important, because it gets down to the fact that when you make something that people want illegal, the only thing you do is drive it underground and make criminals rich and powerful, which to any society is incredibly detrimental.
Well, and even more barbaric the harder we fight it, as has been proven in Mexico.
Yes.
Because they make Iraq and Afghanistan look like lightweights with what they have going on.
Oh yeah, it's just horrible. Once again, as one spokesman said, it isn't a war against drugs, it's a war for drugs, because what it is degenerated down to is everybody's trying to get a piece of the action. Because when you've got a product like marijuana that can literally be raised, we were watching last night, we had a postcard from the 1920s where pharmaceutical marijuana was for sale by mail at 20 cents a pound. Now, indexing for inflation, that means it would be $3 a pound today. And when you've got something that will literally cost you $3 to $5 to produce and mail across the country, and you can sell it for $600 to $1,000 and get an amazing markup, profitable markup. The idea of making that illegal is not going to work, because there are people who will, no matter what the risk, want to become rich as opposed to, you know, working at Walmart.
Well, let's play Who Wants to Be a Billionaire.
Yes.
Somebody's always going to step up to that plate and take a swing.
Yes, and under alcohol, and the amazing thing is, under alcohol prohibition, you have a young thug like Al Capone at 26 running literally a $150 million a year enterprise, which indexed for inflation would make him basically the CEO of $1 billion corporation, and yet and literally just the streets of Chicago ran red with blood from the people he killed. No one even knows how many people this ruthless thug killed. And the only thing they could get him on was tax evasion, because he was making so much money he couldn't hide it. He was, you know, living in a hotel, luxury hotel, and wearing silk underwear, and it's just like, you know, where's your money, dude? And they had to get him on income tax evasion. He spent 6 or 7 years in prison, and then was released and went to Florida to slowly die of syphilis in his mansion. And that happened to a lot of those guys. They all ended up in mansions. No matter what happened to them, they were making so much money. And when you have a criminal organization that can make money by selling something that people want and who do not want to cooperate with the police department with, it's almost impossible to get these guys arrested, because no one wants this to go away except the police and the politicians, who sometimes in themselves don't want it to go away because they're on the take.
Well, this past week, Otis McClade, when he interviewed Eric Sterling, they were talking about that fact that when they put together these mandatory minimum laws, the idea was to go after the kingpins. Mm-hmm. But then they kept lowering the bar. It started out at, ton lots, hundreds of pounds, and it wound up where 5 grams made you a kingpin.
Yes.
and sent you to prison.
Yes,
that's how far off base these laws have become.
And they've made us we're the second highest ratio of at one time of people incarcerated after, I think, South Africa or some other country that or Colombia.
Well, actually, John, the arrest rate per capita of the U.S. Of blacks.
Oh yes.
Was some 7 to 1 more strict than was South Africa.
Yes, and we can't ignore the idea that this is, to its core, a racist policy. It is the last vestige of racism in this country. We have a black president, yet we continue to have this incredible disparity in minority arrests for people, and it's used as a mechanism basically to extend this racist policy, and it is racist in its applications. It's just absolutely
I have Michelle Alexander scheduled, as I said, for July 25th. That's a ways off. But she's author of The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness.
Absolutely.
Speaks exactly to what you're saying there.
Yes. Well, we got to go here. We're almost out of time. Thank you so very much for calling us, Dean, and keep up the good work, okay?
To John.
Bye-bye. Yes, Dean Becker, long-time crusader, radio host of the Unvarnished Truth and the 420 Drug Report on the mighty 90.1 Pacifica KPFT. That's it for now. Thank you very much for tuning in, and remember, this war must end.
We have these private prisons that have now hired lobbyists to go get minimum mandatory review.
I began to understand that the 17 or the 19-year-old kid I had in the backseat of my police car was not a criminal at all.
Remove the profit motive. If you remove the profit motive, you can do away with almost all these problems. And how do you do that? Simple. You end prohibition, which can only mean one thing. Legalize drugs. Legalize all drugs.
If we really want to improve our urban neighborhoods, the most important thing that we could do, the single most important thing that we could